My daughter-in-law introduced me to her dinner guests as the handyman. Not once, as a slip, but 3 times over the course of the evening, deliberately, each time with a little apologetic smile at her guests, the smile you give when you are being gracious to the help. She said, "Oh, do not mind him. That is just Walter, the handyman. He keeps the building running. He is very reliable." And her guests, 8 of them, dressed in the careful, expensive way that people dress when they are trying to look like they belong somewhere they are not sure they belong, nodded at me, the way you nod at a waiter, politely, without seeing me, and went back to their conversation. What my daughter-in-law did not know, what none of them at that table knew, was that I owned the building. I owned the building she was living in. I owned the building 3 of her guests were about to try to lease office space in. I owned, in fact, most of the block, and I had owned it all quietly for 20 years. And I was standing in my son's dining room being called the handyman by his wife, in a condo that I owned, at a dinner party thrown for people who were, though they did not know it yet, entirely at my mercy. My name is Walter Kessler. I am 69 years old, and I have spent 40 years buying buildings that other people underestimated, in neighborhoods that other people wrote off, quietly, patiently, never once feeling the need to look like a rich man. Because I learned early that the man who looks rich is the man everyone is trying to take money from, and the man who looks like the handyman is the man nobody watches, and the man nobody watches sees everything. I want to tell you what happened that night, and over the 6 months that followed, because it is the strangest and most instructive thing that has ever happened to me. And because if you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, looked through, called the handyman by someone who did not bother to find out who you were, then you are going to understand exactly why I did what I did. Let me tell you about the handyman principle first, because it makes the whole story make sense. The man who looks like money attracts everyone who wants money, and everyone wants money, so he spends his life fending off schemers and flatterers and relatives with opportunities and maintaining an image and losing pieces of himself to all of it. But the man in the plain shirt and the ordinary car walks through the world unmolested, because no one is trying to take from a man who appears to have nothing, and a man who is left alone can think and watch and move, and over 40 years he quietly accumulates more than all the flashy men combined, because he never lost a dollar to an image he had to maintain. I learned this young, watching the rich men my father worked for as a plumber, most of whom were not actually rich. They were performing rich, leveraged and terrified, and the few who were truly wealthy were always the quiet ones, the ones you would never pick out of a crowd. I decided, as a young man, to be the quiet kind. My wife Eleanor and I built it together, over 40 years, one building at a time. Eleanor had the eye, the instinct for a neighborhood about to turn, and I had the discipline about never overpaying, and between us we built, quietly, an empire that no one knew existed. Eleanor died 6 years ago, and I miss her every day, and she is the only person who ever fully knew what we owned, because we agreed, the 2 of us, to raise our son without the knowledge of it. We had both seen what money does to children who grow up knowing it is there, and we decided we would let our son make his own way, and tell him the truth when he was old enough to handle it, when he had built something of his own, and could not be corrupted by learning what was waiting. We may have made a mistake. I do not know, because the thing we did not count on was Vanessa. My son Daniel married Vanessa 9 years ago, and I understood her within 10 minutes of meeting her, the way you understand a building the moment you walk in, whether the bones are good or whether it is all paint over rot. Vanessa was paint over rot. She was beautiful and charming and ambitious in the specific way that has nothing to do with building things and everything to do with acquiring the appearance of them, and she had married my son because she had assessed him as a rising man, and over the years of their marriage I watched her grow first impatient, then disappointed, then quietly contemptuous, as she realized that Daniel was going to give her comfort, but not the wealth she craved, and that the in-laws, the ordinary parents in their ordinary house, were no help at all. She had no idea. That is the thing to hold on to through this whole story. Vanessa had spent 9 years married into a family that owned, quietly, more than she could imagine. And she had no idea, because we had raised Daniel not to know, and Daniel could not tell her what he did not know himself. So Vanessa lived her whole married life in a frustrated striving, clawing for a wealth she felt entitled to, resentful of the ordinary in-laws who could not help her get it, standing the entire time on top of a fortune she could not see, like a woman digging for water while standing on an ocean. I found it almost unbearably ironic, once I understood it, and I found it instructive, because Vanessa's treatment of me, believing I had nothing to offer, told me everything about who she really was. People show you their true face when they believe you cannot do anything for them or to them. The way a person treats the waiter, the handyman, the person they have assessed as powerless, that is the truest thing you will ever learn about them, because they have no reason to perform. And Vanessa, believing I was nobody, an ordinary retired man, showed me over 9 years exactly who she was, and I filed it away, quietly, the way I file everything, and I waited. Let me tell you how the treatment went, because the dinner was not a beginning, it was a culmination. When Eleanor was alive, Vanessa was merely cool to us, dismissive, in the way a striving person is dismissive of people who cannot advance their position. She forgot to invite us to things. She spoke to Eleanor, who was worth 10 of her, in a slightly condescending tone. Eleanor saw it and did not care, because Eleanor had the deep, unbothered confidence of a person who knows exactly what she is and does not need it recognized by anyone. Eleanor used to say, "Walter, that girl thinks she is looking down on me, and she has no idea she is looking up, and that is the funniest thing I have ever seen, and I am not going to spoil it for her." Then Eleanor died, and everything got worse, because a widower alone is the most dismissible thing there is. The invitations stopped almost entirely, and Vanessa began to treat me as useful, which was somehow more insulting than being treated as useless, because I was, in her mind, a retired man with time on his hands. She began to volunteer me for things, tasks, the way you volunteer an unpaid intern. Walter can pick up the dry cleaning. Walter can wait for the plumber. Walter can watch the children. It is not as if he has a life. And I did these things, all of them, without complaint. And every time I did one, I watched her file me a little more firmly into the category of person who exists to be used. And I let her, because a man learning the truth about someone does not interrupt the lesson. Let me give you specific examples, because the pattern only becomes real in the specifics. There was the Christmas, the second one after Eleanor died, when Vanessa assigned me, without asking, to spend the day in the kitchen washing dishes, while the family and her guests enjoyed themselves, and she brought her friends in to introduce them to me over the sink, saying, "This is Daniel's father. He insisted on helping. Is that not sweet?" When I had insisted on nothing, in a house whose mortgage I could have paid off with a single phone call. There was the birthday party for my own grandchildren, where I was seated at a separate small table with the caterers, because the main table was full of Vanessa's friends, and one of the caterers, a kind young woman, asked me if I was with the party or with them, meaning the staff, and I said, "A little of both, it seems." And we had a pleasant afternoon while my daughter-in-law performed her important life for people who did not care about her. Every one of these was a gift, a page in the complete and accurate file I was building on exactly who Vanessa was, and I was not humiliated to receive it. I was grateful, the way an investigator is grateful for evidence. Here is a thing you should understand about me, because it is the key to everything. I was not humiliated by any of this. Vanessa believed she was humiliating me, and she was wrong, and her wrongness was the whole game. You cannot humiliate a man who knows exactly what he is. Humiliation requires that some part of you believe the low estimate other people are placing on you, and I did not believe it, not for 1 second, because I knew what I owned, and so her every attempt to make me small only ever made her smaller in my eyes, because it revealed, again and again, the meanness in her. And a person who is cruel to those they believe are powerless is telling you the most important thing you can know about them, which is what they would do to you if they ever had power over you. So I watched and I waited, and then Vanessa threw the dinner party. And the whole picture became clear, and the right action became obvious. Daniel and Vanessa lived, at that time, in a very nice condominium in a building downtown. A building with a doorman and a gym and a rooftop terrace. What they did not know was that I owned that building. I had bought it 11 years earlier, and when Daniel had mentioned, years ago, that they were thinking of moving there, I had said nothing, only made a quiet call to the management company I employed to run the building, and instructed them to give the young couple a very good rate. So Daniel and Vanessa had lived for years in a below-market apartment in a luxury building, believing they had gotten lucky, never knowing that the luck was their own father, the handyman, quietly subsidizing the life they used to look down on him for. There is an irony in that apartment that I have savored for years. Vanessa spent her married life looking down on her ordinary in-laws, resenting them for being unable to fund the elevated life she craved. And the entire time she was living in a luxury apartment at a fraction of its real cost, an apartment she believed she had cleverly secured through her own savvy, when in truth, the discount was a quiet gift from the very father-in-law she despised, subsidizing, month after month, the exact lifestyle she looked down on him for being unable to provide. She looked down on me from a height that I was invisibly holding up. Every month she felt superior to me. I was paying for the privilege of her superiority, and she never knew. Vanessa's dinner party was, I understood the moment I was invited, a strategic event. She had gotten close to a circle of people she desperately wanted to be part of, people with money, or the appearance of it, and this dinner was her bid to consolidate her place among them. She had invited 8 carefully selected guests, and she had invited me, I realized, not out of warmth, but because she needed the table to look full and established and familial, and an old father-in-law in the corner served that purpose, as long as he stayed in the corner and did not embarrass her. And so, to make sure I understood my place, she introduced me, when I arrived in my plain clothes, as the handyman. When Vanessa opened the door and saw me in my plain clothes, there was a half-second before she spoke when I watched her mind work, and I want to describe it, because it is a masterclass in a certain kind of person. She saw me, and I watched her make a rapid social calculation. The calculation of a woman who has invited 8 important guests, and now has to account for the presence of a shabby old man. And I watched her arrive at the solution, and be pleased with it, because it solved 2 problems at once. It hid the fact that her father-in-law was an ordinary retired man, which embarrassed her, and it converted him into evidence of her own graciousness, a bit of staff she was kind enough to feed, which flattered her. And what made it not merely cruel, but genuinely revealing, was that she did it to her own husband's father, in front of strangers, without a flicker of hesitation, which told me there was no floor in Vanessa beneath which she would not go, that she would sacrifice anyone's dignity, even family, for a marginal social advantage in front of people who did not matter. Daniel was standing behind her when she did it, and I want to tell you about my son's face in that moment, because it is the most important thing in this story. His face flinched. There was a flash of shame, of protest, of "This is my father, what are you doing?" And then the flinch passed, and his face smoothed over, and he said nothing, and he looked away, and he let it happen. He let his wife introduce his father as the help, in front of a room full of strangers, because saying something would have embarrassed Vanessa, and my son had long ago made the calculation that his wife's comfort was worth more than his father's dignity. When I say his face flinched, I mean that for a fraction of a second, the boy I raised was visible in the man he had become, the boy who would have been horrified, who would have said, "Vanessa, that is my father." That boy surfaced for half a second, and then I watched him get pushed back down, watched my grown son make the calculation, weigh his father's dignity against his wife's displeasure, and choose, as he had chosen 1,000 times, to avoid the displeasure. And the choice was so practiced, so smooth, that I understood I was not watching a single failure. I was watching the accumulated result of a decade of failures. A man who had trained himself, choice by choice, to abandon whatever was right whenever it was inconvenient. And I grieved, standing in that doorway, not for myself. Being called the handyman cost me nothing, but for my son, because I was watching the exact shape of what he had lost, which was himself. I could have stopped it right there. I could have said, in a mild, pleasant voice, "Actually, I am Daniel's father, and as it happens, I own this building." I could have detonated the whole thing in one sentence, and for 1 second I considered it, but I did not. And the reason is the reason this story is worth telling. Because I realized, standing in that doorway being called the handyman, that I was being handed something rare, which was the chance to see these people completely, to watch them be exactly who they were when they believed there was no one important in the room, and I have never passed up the chance to see people completely, because seeing people completely is the only real power there is. So I said, "Happy to help," and I became the handyman. And I want to be clear that this took no effort, no swallowing of pride, because there was no pride to swallow. A man who knows what he is does not feel diminished by playing a smaller part, the way a great actor does not feel diminished by a small role, because the greatness is in him, not in the size of the part. I put on the character of the handyman the way you put on an old coat, comfortably, and I stepped into that dinner, and I began to watch. I spent that dinner the way I have spent my whole career, watching, quietly, from the position of the person nobody watches, and I saw everything. And what I heard as I listened was Vanessa working the room, and it was a masterpiece of a certain kind of striving, and it was also, to anyone who actually had money, transparently try hard. She dropped names, she mentioned prices, and her guests did the same. All of them performing wealth for each other, a whole table of people pretending to be rich, none of them realizing that the only actually wealthy person in the room was the man they had been told was the handyman. But here is the part that made me pay close attention. As I listened, I began to place the guests, and 3 of them, I realized, were not just random strivers. 3 of them were people I was about to be in business with, though they did not know it, and neither did Vanessa. There was a man named Prescott, who spent the evening loudly explaining that his firm was expanding into a new floor of office space downtown. And I knew, because I knew everything about my own buildings, that Prescott's firm had a letter of intent to lease the 4th floor of a building 3 blocks away, a building I owned, and that I would be, in a matter of weeks, the man on the other side of that negotiation. There was a woman named Claire, trying to raise money for a small development project, and I knew that her project was undercapitalized and would need a partner with deep pockets to survive, and that she would, within the year, come looking for exactly the kind of quiet money I represented. And there was a couple, the Hendersons, about to sign a large lease on a flagship retail space, and the space they described was on the ground floor of the building we were sitting in, the building Vanessa lived in and looked down on the handyman from, the building I owned. So there I was, being called the help by my son's wife, in a room full of people who were, 3 of them, about to discover that their entire business futures ran directly through the old man they were nodding at, like a waiter. And Vanessa had no idea. Near the end of dinner, Vanessa did the thing that decided everything. One of her guests, the man Prescott, asked me a question, in the slightly performed way that people ask questions of the help when they want to demonstrate how down-to-earth they are. He said, "So, Walter, handyman work, that must be steady. Always something breaking. You do all right?" And there was a little laugh around the table, and Vanessa answered for me, before I could speak, and she said, "Oh, Walter does fine. He is very careful with his money. People like Walter have to be. They do not have the cushion the rest of us have. But he manages. He is quite the little saver. It is rather sweet, actually. People like Walter. The cushion the rest of us have. Quite the little saver. It is rather sweet. The table laughed. Warmly, condescendingly. And my son laughed with them. And I sat in the least important seat at a table in a building I owned, being described as a careful little saver by a woman who was, at that moment, 3 months behind on the maintenance fees she paid to my company. And I smiled, and I said, I do all right. I have always believed in saving. You would be surprised what a person can put away over 40 years. And I let it land as the humble statement of a humble little man. And only I knew that I had just told them the exact and complete truth, and that the truth, spoken plainly to people who have decided you are nobody, is the safest secret there is, because their contempt makes them deaf. There is a particular pleasure, I will be honest, in being underestimated that completely. It is the pleasure of clarity, of watching people show you exactly who they are, because they have no idea who you are, of holding, in silence, a truth so large that its mere existence, unspoken, transforms the meaning of everything being said around you. Every condescending word they spoke, I heard doubled. I heard what they meant, and I heard what was actually true. And the gap between the two was so enormous and so invisible to them that I sat at that table in a state of almost unbearable private amusement, an amusement I could share with no one, because the only person who would have understood it, who would have caught my eye across the table and had to look away to keep from laughing, was Eleanor. And Eleanor was 6 years gone, and I missed her at that table more than I had in a long time, because that dinner was exactly the kind of thing she found funniest in the world, the spectacle of small, cruel people looking down from a great height on a mountain they could not see they were standing at the foot of. I went home that night to my modest house that I owned outright, and I sat in the dark, and I did not feel humiliated, because you cannot humiliate a man who knows what he is. But I felt something else, colder and clearer, which was decision, because the dinner had shown me everything. It had shown me who Vanessa was, completely. It had shown me who my son had become, which was harder to look at. And it had shown me, in the persons of Prescott and Claire and the Hendersons, that the instruments of a lesson were sitting at that very table. But I want to be clear about what the lesson was for. Because if you think this is a story about an old man taking revenge on a rude daughter-in-law, you have misunderstood me. I did not do what I did to hurt Vanessa. I did it because of my son, because of the flinch and the smoothing over. Because my son had stood in a room and watched his wife call his father the help and had said nothing, and I understood that my son was drowning, in a marriage and a life built entirely on the performance of a wealth he did not have, and that if I did nothing, he would spend the rest of his life this way, small and ashamed and complicit, and I was not willing to let that be the end of my son's story, not while I had the power to change it. And I had, as it happened, a great deal of power. So here is what I did. I did nothing, at first. I let 2 weeks pass. When you have been wronged, and you have the power to respond, every instinct screams to respond immediately. And that instinct is almost always wrong, because the immediate response is the emotional one, and it announces itself as revenge, and it is smaller and cruder than the response you would design if you waited. I have made every important decision of my life from calm, never anger, because anger cannot see the whole board. So I let 2 weeks pass. And then, when the time was right, I began, quietly, to let the truth arrive, not as an announcement, but the way I have always let the truth arrive, through the ordinary channels of business, so that each person learned it in the course of their own affairs, and could never claim it had been done to shame them, because it had simply been done in the normal course of things. I want to say a word about the order in which I let the truth arrive, because it was deliberate. I did not want it to land on Vanessa first, or even on my son first. I wanted it to land, first, on the people she was trying to impress, the circle, because those were the people whose opinion she actually cared about, the people for whom the entire performance existed, And the deepest wound to a person like Vanessa is not to be exposed to her family, whom she does not respect, but to be exposed to the audience she is performing for, because the audience is the only thing that is real to her. So I let it land on the circle first, quietly, one lease at a time. And by the time Vanessa learned the truth, the entire audience she cared about had already known it for a month, had already been quietly laughing, and her humiliation was not a fresh wound, but an old one that had healed over in everyone's mind except her own, which is a far worse thing, to discover that everyone has known for a month the thing that destroys you. Prescott was first. His firm's lease came up for final negotiation about 3 weeks after the dinner, and Prescott came to the meeting expecting a leasing agent, and instead, because I had instructed it, he was shown into a conference room, and the door opened, and in walked the handyman. "I would give a great deal to have a photograph of his face," he said, uncertainly. "Walter, I think there has been a mix-up. I am here to see the owner." And I said, pleasantly, "Yes, Mr. Prescott, that is me. I own the building. I own quite a few buildings." We met at my son's dinner party, though I do not believe my daughter-in-law introduced me by my full role. "Please, sit." I did not punish Prescott. He had done nothing but be a bit condescending at a dinner party, which is a small sin, and I do not ruin people over small sins. I gave him a fair lease, a good one, exactly what he would have gotten anyway, and I did it graciously, and Prescott spent the meeting recalibrating everything he thought he knew, and by the end of it, he understood that the humble little saver his hostess had condescended to was the owner of the building his own offices would sit in, and a considerably wealthier man than anyone at that dinner, and that his hostess was, therefore, a woman who did not know who her own father-in-law was, who had mocked the wealthiest man she would ever meet, to his face, out of pure snobbery. Prescott did not keep this to himself. Of course he did not. It was too good a story, and within weeks it had traveled quietly through the exact circle of people Vanessa had been trying so hard to impress, the story of the woman who called her own father-in-law the handyman without knowing he owned the building. And it traveled not as gossip I had spread, because I spread nothing, but as the natural consequence of the truth becoming visible, which cannot be stopped once it begins. Claire was next, and Claire's was different, because Claire actually needed something from me. She came looking for money for her project, not knowing whose company it was, and when she discovered that the deep-pocketed investor was the handyman from Vanessa's dinner, she did not maneuver the way Prescott had. She was mortified, and she said, "Mr. Kessler, I owe you an apology. I was at that dinner, and I said nothing when Vanessa introduced you that way, and I should have, and I am ashamed of it, and I understand if you do not want to work with someone who let that happen." And I looked at Claire, and I saw that her shame was real, that she was a person who had made a small failure of courage, and knew it and owned it, which is a completely different thing from a person who is cruel by nature. And I invested in Claire's project, on good terms, and it succeeded, and we do business to this day. Because the lesson was never about punishing everyone in the room, it was about revealing everyone in the room, letting each person's true nature become visible in the light of the truth, and rewarding the decent ones, and letting the cruel ones face the natural consequences of their cruelty. The Hendersons learned the truth when their lease came up, and they, like Prescott, spent their meeting recalibrating, and the story grew larger and truer and more inescapable, and I did none of it. I simply owned the buildings and conducted my business, as I always had, and let the truth do what truth does when you stop hiding it, which is to reorganize everyone's understanding of everything. And through all of this, Vanessa knew nothing for a few weeks. She lived in her building, my building, and went about her striving, unaware that the circle she had worked so hard to enter was now quietly telling and retelling the story of her greatest humiliation. The humiliation she had not yet even learned had occurred. Daniel learned the truth before Vanessa did. I made sure of that, because Daniel was the whole point, and his education could not happen in a room full of people. It had to happen between a father and a son. I invited my son to lunch, just the two of us, which had not happened in years, and I told him everything, about the buildings, all of them, about what his mother and I had built over 40 years, about the decision we had made to raise him without the knowledge of it. And I watched his face go through the whole journey, the disbelief, the vertigo of a man discovering that the entire financial reality of his life had been different from what he believed, that he had spent his whole adult life standing on a fortune he could not see, exactly like Vanessa, digging for water on the shore of an ocean. And then I told him the other thing, the thing that mattered, and I did not soften it. I said, "Daniel, I did not tell you this so you would feel rich. I told you because I need you to understand what happened at that dinner. Your wife called your father the handyman 3 times in front of strangers, and you looked away. You let it happen because her comfort was worth more to you than my dignity. And I need you to understand that the money changes nothing about that. You are going to be a rich man someday, and being rich will not fix what is broken in you, because what is broken in you is not a lack of money. It is a lack of spine, and no inheritance ever grew a man a spine. Your mother and I kept the money from you because we did not want it to hollow you out, and something hollowed you out anyway. And it was not the presence of money, it was the absence of courage. My son wept at that ordinary restaurant. And when he was done, he asked me the question that told me there was still something in him worth the trouble. He did not ask about the money, how much, or what he would inherit. He asked, "Dad, how do I fix it? Not the money, me. How do I fix me?" And I told him the truth, which is that you do not fix a thing like that all at once. You fix it the way you fix a building, one repair at a time, starting with the foundation. And that the foundation, in his case, was a single act of courage he had been avoiding for years, which was to stop letting his wife be cruel, to name it when it happened, starting with himself, and that this would cost him the peace of his marriage, might cost him the marriage, because a marriage in which one person has grown comfortable being cruel does not usually survive the other person growing a spine, and that he had to decide whether he wanted a comfortable marriage built on his own smallness or an uncomfortable freedom built on his own recovered dignity, and that no one, not even his father with all his buildings, could make that choice for him. Daniel made the choice. It was not clean or fast, because Vanessa, when she finally learned the truth, first about the money and then about the humiliation that had traveled through her precious circle, reacted exactly as I would have predicted, not with shame, never with shame, but with a frantic overnight reversal, a total transformation from the woman who called me the handyman into a woman who could not stop telling me how wonderful I was, how she had always known there was something special about me. It was grotesque, the speed of it, and it told me, more than anything else could have, that there had never been anything real in her, that she was pure calculation all the way down, and that the warmth she now performed was exactly as hollow as the contempt she had performed before, both simply strategies, adjusted instantly to the new information about where the power lay. And Daniel saw it too. That is what saved him. He watched his wife transform overnight from contempt to adoration the moment she learned he was rich, and my son, who had spent 9 years unable to see his wife clearly, finally saw her, because the money had done the one useful thing money can do, which is to reveal people, to show you who they are, by showing you how they change when they learn you have it. They divorced within the year. It was not because of the money, or not only. It was because Daniel, having finally found the courage to name one cruelty, found that he could name others, and that once a man starts telling the truth in his own home, he cannot easily stop, and that a marriage, built on his silence, could not survive his voice. Vanessa fought it, but she had signed, years earlier, a prenuptial agreement that Eleanor had quietly insisted upon, because Eleanor read people, and Eleanor had read Vanessa in 10 minutes at that first dinner, and said, "Walter, that girl is marrying a paycheck. Make sure our son signs the paper, because one day she will find out he is worth more than she thinks, and on that day we will want the paper. And we had made sure Daniel signed it, and it held, and Eleanor, 6 years dead, reached out of the grave one more time to protect her son from the consequences of his own poor judgment. Daniel is different now. It has been 2 years. He is not a finished man. Courage recovered late is never as sure as courage that was never lost. But he is trying, and after the divorce he asked if he could learn the business, the real business, and I said yes. And I have spent the last 2 years teaching my son what I know, walking him through neighborhoods the way Eleanor once walked me. He is not a natural, not the way Eleanor was, and I cannot teach him the eye, because that was her gift, and it does not pass down easily. But I am teaching him the other thing, the thing that can be taught, the discipline, the patience, the refusal to overpay, the willingness to be underestimated, and that he is learning. And I have watched the work change him, day by day. Not the money, the work. The slow, honest work of running the numbers and walking the properties, and dealing plainly with tenants and contractors. Giving my son, at last, a sense of his own worth that comes from the inside, from having done a real thing well, rather than from the approval of a woman or the estimation of a circle. And a man who is building his worth from the inside cannot be made small by anyone, because his worth is not in their gift, it is his own, built by his own hands, and no one can take it away, because no one gave it to him. I watch it happening, and I think Eleanor would be pleased. And in a strange way, we should thank Vanessa, because if she had never called me the handyman, if she had merely continued the quiet contempt of the years before, I might never have acted. My son might have drifted forever in his small, ashamed life, and the truth might never have surfaced. It was her cruelty, at its loudest, that broke the thing open, that forced the moment. The worst thing she ever did to me turned out to be the thing that saved my son. I do not thank her, exactly, because she meant none of it as a gift, and a cruelty does not become a kindness just because good came of it. But I have made my peace with it, because the universe has a way of using even the meanest people as instruments of things they never intended. And Vanessa, who wanted only to climb, ended up, against her will, being the ladder my son climbed out of the pit she had helped dig for him. So here is what I want to say to you. If you have listened this far, and if you have ever been underestimated, dismissed, called the handyman by someone who did not bother to find out who you were, do not be humiliated, because humiliation is a thing you do to yourself. It requires your own agreement. It requires that some part of you believe the low estimate, and if you know what you are, truly know it, then no one can place a low estimate on you that you are obliged to accept. Let them underestimate you. It is the most valuable thing that can happen to you, because the person who underestimates you shows you their whole self, holds nothing back, and in that unguarded contempt, they hand you the complete and accurate map of who they are, which is the most useful information there is. And then, if the moment ever comes when the truth must surface, do not announce it, do not brandish it, do not make a speech. Simply let it arrive, through the ordinary channels, in the ordinary course of things, and let it do its own work, because the truth revealed quietly is 1,000 times more powerful than the truth shouted, and it can never be dismissed as spite, because it is simply what was always the case, becoming visible at last. And guard the inside. Whatever they call you, whatever box they put you in, keep the true knowledge of what you are safe in the one place they cannot reach, which is your own quiet certainty. And then it does not matter what they call you, because their names do not touch the thing itself. The thing itself is yours. And a man who holds his worth in that place is free, truly free, free in a way that no amount of recognition could ever make him, because his worth does not depend on anyone, was not given by anyone, and therefore can be taken by no one. I was called the handyman at my own son's table, by my son's wife, while my son looked away. And it was the best thing that ever happened to my family, because it broke the false story we had all been living inside. And in the wreckage of that false story, my son found the one thing I could never buy him with all my buildings, which was himself. I want to tell you one more thing about my son, because it is the thing I am proudest of, and it happened just last month. We were walking a neighborhood together, and we stopped for coffee, and the young man behind the counter was rude, dismissive, the way tired young people sometimes are with older men in plain clothes. And I watched my son not do the thing he would once have done, which was to perform importance, to let the young man know he was somebody. Instead, my son was kind to the rude young man, patient, tipped him well, and when we left, Daniel said, "Dad, that kid has no idea who we are, and it does not matter, does it? Because who we are is not his to know or to grant. It is just what we are." And I laughed, because he had understood it. Finally, the whole thing, the handyman principle all the way down, that the estimation of others is nothing, that a man carries his worth inside him, or he does not carry it at all. The buildings will pass to Daniel someday, all of them, and he will be a rich man, and it will not hollow him out, because he found his foundation first, in the hard years after the humiliation, and a man who has his own foundation cannot be hollowed out by anything. Eleanor knew that. Eleanor knew everything, years in advance. I just had to live long enough, and watch closely enough, and wait patiently enough, to see her be right one more time. She usually was.